Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. With exactly a week to go for the budget, we raised two critical questions. What is the state of the economy? And what are the areas of particular concern that need specific attention? Those are the critical issues I shall raise today with one of India's foremost economists, the country's former chief statistician and the country director of the International Growth Centre, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, before I come to details and specifics, with exactly a week to go for the budget, let me ask you, what is your broad view of the state of the economy?
What should I say? It's mixed. I mean, people keep talking about the K-shaped recovery, and it really is the curate's egg. Parts of it are very good, parts of it are actually very bad. And the thing is that the way it seems to have been segmented is the way which is worrying. It's not by sectors so much as it is by firm size. So the larger companies, the larger corporates, the ones with deep pockets have done very well across sectors. So it's very broad-based in the sectoral sense. And the MSMEs and the unorganized sector is continuing to do very poorly. Now, this is getting reflected in various parameters that are measured by the government. And the problem with this particular story is that it's relatively difficult to address.
In a sense, you're suggesting we're becoming two countries. One well-off, well-protected, getting richer. The other poor and getting poorer perhaps by the day.
Yes, and this is something we've talked about earlier as well, which was the immediate impact. The real issue that confronts us today is what can the government do about it, or has the government missed the bus?
I'll come to that in a moment's time. But before we discuss what can the government do, let's go to some of the details and specifics about the actual state of the problem. Mm-hmm. Now, when we come to specifics, I presume we have to base ourselves on the first advance estimates which were released by the government on the 7th of January. But how reliable and credible are they? I've read that some people think they're a work of fiction. What's your opinion of them?
Well, Karan, to put it frankly, it's a work of historical fiction because there is some history behind it. So what the NSO has when it comes out with the first advance estimate is hard data for 2 quarters and little bits and pieces of data for 7 months, some for 9 months. And it tries to put all this together to essentially project the next half year. So there is a lot of fiction in it, and the way that fiction, that particular narrative is usually drawn out is by really appealing to the patterns that have been observed in the past. The problem, of course, is in the last couple of years, those patterns have just been completely shot because of COVID, because of lockdowns. And therefore, the ability to actually predict what the last 2 quarters of the fiscal will do is seriously impaired, which is why I think a lot of people are calling it fiction.
In which case, let me ask you this. These first estimates forecast that the economy this year will grow by 9.2%. Given the double limitations you've pointed out, how realistic is that?
Well, it may not be too unrealistic. And the reason really goes back to what we are discussing. The quarterly estimates actually depend heavily on corporate data, very heavily. And as I said, corporate India is doing very well. And if you're actually extrapolating what corporate India is doing, you may get actually figures which prima facie will look very reliable. The problem will be when the data for the unorganized sector and the non-corporate sector at large come in, but that's going to be 2 years later.
So we will get away with the belief that we're reaching 9.2% growth because we don't really know for 2 years more what is the situation in the unorganized sector.
Yes.
Where 80% of our people work.
Well, yes. In direct sense, yes. Indirect sense, you will know, and you should know by next year. And the reason for it is that if the unorganized sector isn't doing well, consumption is not going to grow.
Okay, now let's begin with the good news, and I'll come to the bad news progressively. The good news in these advanced estimates is that agriculture is growing at 3.9%, which is 7.6% more than the pre-pandemic year of 2019-2020. And similarly, manufacturing is growing at 12.5%, which is 4.5% above pre-pandemic levels. Does this in a very real sense suggest this is the basis on which the economy has some strength?
Well, you see, as far as agriculture is concerned, I think there are two features that we need to take note of. The first, of course, is that agriculture was completely unaffected by the series of lockdowns that we've had, unlike other sectors, including manufacturing. And the second is that by God's grace, agriculture has performed very well. So you have these two factors which have played out in agriculture's favor, and agriculture has responded. So far as manufacturing is concerned, again, as I said, it goes back to the old story. What is it that you're measuring in manufacturing? You're certainly being able to measure what the corporate sector is doing fairly accurately. You're being able to measure a part of the non-corporate sector which is registered under the Factories Act. But then the Factories Act registers only units which employ more than 20 people, which means that the really small units, the micro units and the unorganized sector in manufacturing, which is not small, we don't know what's happening there.
I'm going to flag something at this point. It seems to me that this divide between the bigger corporates doing well and the smaller ones, which may be the majority of corporates actually doing very poorly, or we not knowing how they're doing it all, that divide is going to run right through this discussion, it seems.
Yes, indeed it will.
So it's worth flagging it for the audience. This is a question mark you're raising about the belief that actually manufacturing is doing as well as the first estimates suggest, because that is almost entirely dependent on the bigger side of manufacturing, the corporate side of manufacturing. What's happening at the MSME level, we don't know.
This is correct. But this is not just a question mark. Since we are about to go into the budget, it's also extremely important in terms of what the government picks up as the areas of focus for the budget. Now, if it completely ignores it because the data seems to suggest that manufacturing is doing very well across the board, then we may be in deeper trouble than we should be.
So we need to flag MSMEs as an area of concern when we come to talk about what is it that the government should be addressing.
This is correct.
But the advance estimates also make clear that there are critical weaknesses in the economy. I mean, for instance, private consumption, which is 55% of GDP, is still 2.9% below pre-pandemic levels. And I suppose you could add to that the fact that other critical areas which are equally important are, for instance, what's happening to private investment. It's 33% of GDP, but it's only grown roughly 2.5%. Would you accept both of these are problems and both reflect a collapse in demand?
Both are problems. And collectively, between the two of them, they do represent a serious lack of demand. As far as the first is concerned, which is consumption, you're right, consumption is about 2.5% less than it was 2 years ago. But if you look at it in terms of per capita consumption, which is how much the average Indian is consuming, that's about 5% less, which means that the average Indian today is consuming 5% less than she was 2 years ago.
Which is particularly worrying.
Which is very worrying. 5% is not a small number given the kind of levels of consumption we are talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, anyway, the consumption levels in India are not great.
That's
a 5% dip takes you perilously close to some form of hunger.
Well, yes and no. I mean, thanks to agriculture, that may not be the case. Because remember, the vast majority of our people are in rural areas, and good agricultural performance will make sure that the supply side at least is there. And also the Indian rural community is a much more caring community than the urban. The problem is really an urban one.
Now, let me come to two other problems, again, in a sense indicated by the advanced estimates. To begin with, services represent 57% of GDP, but if you look at the biggest chunk of services, trades, hotels, transport, communication, etc., that chunk is still 8.4% below pre-pandemic levels. And then when you look at construction, which is the single biggest employer, it's only grown roughly 1.1% over the last 2 years. Again, both of these are problem areas.
They are problem. Services, by and large, are problem areas, and contact services have suffered the most because they've suffered both from the policy action, which are the lockdowns and so on, and if you look at the kind of lockdowns or partial lockdowns that are happening, they fall disproportionately on services. So manufacturing is usually allowed to continue, but services are closed. The second, of course, is the fear factor, that a lot of people are not willing to subject themselves to contact services just out of the fear of getting COVID. So it's a double whammy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, the point is that this is a sector which can bounce back very quickly once these restraints go. The big question mark, of course, is when will they go? We don't know.
This is where Omicron becomes distressing.
This is correct.
Because it can delay the recovery in these sectors by weeks or months.
Or longer, we have no idea. And it is this uncertainty that really causes a lot of problems.
Let me come to a different sort of problem, once again indicated by the first advanced estimate. So far we've talked about problems to do with sectors of the economy. I'm now talking about a problem which I think is because the government hasn't responded the way it said it was going to do so when it announced the budget last year. At the time, the finance minister committed herself to increasing government expenditure by 34.5%. Has that happened? Because I'm not an expert, but when I look at the first estimates, it certainly doesn't look as if it's happened.
No, it hasn't happened. It certainly hasn't happened. And it actually gets a little worse because that 34.5% that you're talking about were at current prices. And what was assumed in the budget was an inflation rate of about 4.5%. What has actually happened, and this is coming out in the national account data, is that the average inflation has been more than 8.5%. So even if they did 34%, in terms of its real impact, it would be about 5% less. That's number one. Number two, of course, it hasn't been anywhere close to it. It's been only close to about 18%. So the increase is very marginal in that.
And this is very strange because this is precisely when you wanted the government to spend to boost the economy that it's failed to do so.
This is the question. If one really looks at the trajectory of government actions ever since COVID started in late March of 20, during the first wave, government had carried out a lot of steps. Some were negative, some were positive. One, of course, was the nationwide lockdown, which was a huge negative, and in retrospect has been proven to be an overkill. But the positive was that the government recognized the damage that was being done and actually stepped in. And there was a whole slew of initiatives. Everybody calls them supply-side initiatives. Yes, they were supply-side, but they were important because what they did, in effect, I mean, this is things like bank moratorium on repayment, new lines of credit for the MSME, and so on and so forth. They were designed to keep units alive till such time as the crisis had passed. The right approach, very well intentioned. How well it was carried out is a different issue, but I think the whole approach was absolutely correct. The real problem comes with the second wave. You have a second wave which is vastly worse than the first. Number one, there was no national lockdown. Okay? But there were lockdowns at the state level. But the central government kind of pretended that it had nothing to do with what was happening in the economy, and there were no efforts whatsoever to try and keep the units which are now under new pressure alive. So my suspicion is that the mortality in the MSME sector was significantly higher during the second wave than the first, even though the lockdown was much harsher in the first. The reason being that in the second, nothing was done to actually help the MSMEs to survive.
And is this exacerbated by the failure to live up to the commitment of increasing government expenditure by 34.5%?
Well, it's not the total amount of expenditure which matters,
But where it goes?
but how it is, where it goes and how it is delivered. So if you listen to what I'm saying, it's much easier to keep a unit alive than to allow a unit to die and then revive it. Because what you've done is you've essentially killed an entrepreneur.
And the government failed to keep units alive?
Alive at that stage. So the real damage, to my mind,
was during
really
the second wave.
Took place during March, April, May of.
Let's then come to something that you hinted at a moment ago, and in a very real sense, it is actually there if you look deeply at the first estimates. It's inflation. Real GDP is projected to grow at 9.2%, nominal GDP at 17.6%, which suggests that inflation will be 8.4%. Is that worryingly high?
Well, we know this is true. Because, when we think about inflation, unfortunately, we've gotten into the habit of focusing only on the consumer price index. Now, the thing is, the consumer price index is that it represents prices only at the final point of sale. And that depends very heavily upon what the consumers are willing and capable of bearing. Now, in a situation where consumer demand is weak to begin with, the ability of companies to pass on the cost increases gets diminished. But if you look at the wider definition of inflation, which includes the increase in costs of all the producers, which is captured by the wholesale price index, and the most comprehensive measure is what's called the GDP deflator, which is what the national accounts are reporting. Wholesale price index is running at upwards of 13%. It was running more than 14% earlier. And the GDP deflator is at about 8.5%. And that is in fact the right story. So what is happening is that a lot of companies are taking a hit on their bottom lines. But when you look at the corporate data that is published, which is of the listed companies, which is the largest of the large companies, what you find is that actually their bottom lines have gone up, which means somebody else is suffering the damage.
But it also means that if you have 8.5% inflation at a time when per capita consumption has fallen by 5%, that in fact it's going to be even more difficult for the poor to consume, because prices going up will deter them. So
Yes.
this adds to the problem for the people who are on the losing end of the impact of COVID.
Yes, it is, and it is already also getting reflected in some of the data that we do have. Because if you look at the retail lending by banks, so overall level of indebtedness of Indian households has gone up very sharply for consumption loans. And this is coming out very clearly in the RBI data. So essentially, households have kept up their consumption.
But they've increased their debt.
Yeah, by increasing debt.
Let's now come to two things you've talked about, and they're clearly not reflected in any sense in the advanced estimates. And the first is MSMEs. They constitute 30% of our GDP, 40% of our employment. Do we have a good idea, or do we have no idea at all of how badly they've suffered over the last 2 years?
We don't have a very good idea yet, okay? Hopefully, the NSO had begun, and it began last year, to do an annual survey of the unincorporated sector. And the results of that first survey should be coming out anytime now. And that will give us an indication as to how bad it really was. Now, this is going to be an ongoing exercise, so hopefully we'll have data on the current fiscal as well, but that will be sometime, I guess, around October or November.
In which case, why don't you give me your idea of where MSMEs are? What's your assessment of how much they've suffered?
My sense is that they have suffered enormously. I would be surprised if on the MSME side we didn't actually see negative growth. Not just last year, I'm talking about this year as well. But what is more worrying than that is we don't know, and we will perhaps never know, how much capacity, production capacity, has gone under.
And disappeared.
Which may not be revivable.
But you're saying two very interesting things. If you believe the MSME sector has actually shrunk and seen negative growth, then that either raises question marks about the 9.2% GDP growth that the estimates are forecasting, or if that 9.2 is achieved, it suggests that the K is a very violently divisive K.
No. What it means is that the upward tail of the K is very sharp. The downward part may be actually reasonably flat. Still down, but it could be flat. But that's not, as I said, the important thing. The important thing is how much capacity has gone under and how many entrepreneurs have simply been driven out, never to come back again, because that's going to determine the pace at which we recover.
This leads directly to the next issue that isn't covered by the estimates either, and this is the one I want to raise: employment. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says that in December, for the whole month, the unemployment level was 7.9%. Labor participation rates have fallen to 40%. The CMIE's own conclusion is that employment has not recovered to its pre-pandemic levels. Actually, I imagine from what you're saying that the extent of unemployment and underemployment combined would be deeply distressing for people.
It is deeply distressing, and the fact is not just people, it's for the whole economy. It's deeply distressing because until that revives, you are not going to see strong growth in consumption. Consumption will continue to be tepid, which means that you will have to rely on investment, and which investor in his right mind would put money into a project without knowing that there's going to be consumption demand at the other end of the...
Particularly when capacity utilization, according to Dr. Rangarajan writing in the Hindu yesterday, is about 60-61%.
Well, it depends. There are different estimates of that. I would tend to imagine what data we have, hard data we have, which is again for corporate India, it's really around 70%.
But that is still means there's a 30% capacity to make up before people are willing to invest for more.
Well, no. Usually the investments take off at about 75% capacity utilization.
But what you're pointing out is that the underemployment and the unemployment is depressing demand, which is in turn depressing consumption, and is therefore a deterrent at the moment to investment.
Yes. The aspect of the CMI data, look, 7.5 might not, unemployment rate may not sound too bad. But the really disturbing part of it is the labor force participation rate.
And it's much lower than our neighboring countries.
Not neighboring countries. I mean, globally, I think we're probably one of the lowest. It had gone down to 38%, it's recovered somewhat to 40%. But you look around you and everybody is well into the 50s and 60s. Now, do you count that as unemployment?
It could be something worse. It could be a sign of people having given up hope they'll find employment and therefore they're not looking for it at all.
That is precisely the point.
Hopelessness.
And, you know, the whole issue was, if you think about what was happening earlier, it had gone under the radar of most of us, which is the kind of migration that was happening from high population, low income states to other states. And this was people actively entering the labor force. When the lockdown happened and you had that mass return migration happening, so these people went back into an economy, a local economy, that was already saturated. So for them, they had no hope of finding work because the people there weren't work, a lot of them weren't working anyway. The question really is that will they have the courage to come back to where the work may be generated? That really is the question.
And we don't know the answer.
We don't know the answer yet. There has been some return of the migrants, but that again are the people who already had a certain amount of security and assurance. But I don't think the vast majority
And in a sense,
have.
this is reflected in two things. The underemployment and unemployment that we're talking about is reflected in the fact that the government has had to raise 50,000 crore more for NREGA, and the government has had to extend the free food 5 kilograms of wheat or rice for right up till the end of March. That's a clear recognition that there is a problem, which is why it's done it. But it's also reflected in the price surveys that came out yesterday on the front page of the Indian Express, which suggests that 60% of the Indian people over the last 5 years have actually seen their income shrink. And for the lowest 20%, it shrunk by almost 53%.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't know how the ICE survey is done, and so I can't really comment on it.
But if it's correct, it's deeply worrying.
It is deeply worrying, but the issue is that given those kinds of numbers, I think there would have been a lot more of restlessness in the country than we are seeing.
Unless, of course, the Indian people are resigned and placid and do not.
Which we are to an extent.
Remember, we literally walked hundreds of millions, perhaps, well, tens of millions for sure, maybe up to 100 million, literally just walked hundreds or thousands of miles, and there was no protest. They accepted their lot in life.
Yes.
So maybe that explains why the terrible price survey hasn't brought out the sort of protest and restlessness you think it should have.
It's amazing because those figures are actually quite scary.
One more question about the current situation. Do you think in these circumstances this year, the finance minister can meet her target of 6.8% fiscal deficit? I know that the tax revenue she's collected is hugely more than she anticipated. But in terms of proceeds from disinvestment and privatization, it's barely a fraction of what she forecast. And there's been a lot of unforeseen additional expenditure on NREGA and on the food scheme. So can she meet 6.8%?
Almost certainly.
She can.
Yes. Remember, expenditures by and large are, except for one or two items, are running well below what was budgeted. Well below.
This explains that failure to reach 34.5.
That's right. That's right.
But tell me, when you fail to reach 34.5, does it mean that a lot of the investment the government was doing to try and boost growth has also failed to happen?
Well, we don't know. We don't know. Because, look, what we do know is that other than 10 ministries, the finance ministry imposed a cut on all the rest. And Government of India has nearly 60 ministries and departments. All right? The point is, we don't know what these ministries have cut. That we will find out only when they submit their expenditure.
But was it wise in these circumstances to impose a cap on expenditure that you had budgeted for? Because if the government doesn't spend when no one else is spending, then there's nothing that's going to oil the wheels of the economy at all.
Yes. See, that's a part of that overall failure during the second wave. But in a sense, I think this is the less egregious part. because this would have been something that we have been demanding when the first wave ended, which was a large fiscal stimulus. Every economist, and all economists now continue to say that there should be a fiscal stimulus. The real issue, and as I said, the more egregious issue, is failure to keep units alive, failure to extend the bank moratoriums, failure to give startup loans, to guarantee loans as they did earlier. All of that, I think, is a more damaging failure than the lack of demand support.
This is, in fact, the failure of the government. Failure to keep units open, allowing them to literally be written off, which would have added to unemployment, which would have added to distress, which has diminished consumption, which has diminished demand. The real failure was during the second wave.
Yes.
April, May, June of last year.
That's right.
And one aspect of that failure is also the failure to spend what you committed yourself to spend as a government, although that, as you say, is the less egregious part of it.
Yes, because if you have failed in the first step, which is keeping units alive, a demand stimulus will simply help those which have remained alive.
Very quickly for the audience, what was it that was needed to be done to keep units alive, which the government didn't do?
Well, pretty much a reprise of what they had done in the previous year, which is
Money in people's pockets.
First, bank loans. Second, provide them with additional working capital, which would be guaranteed by the government, so that they can at least limp along on a very curtailed demand. Third, once these two at least are done, the third would be a demand stimulus so that they can scale up their production.
So the three
But
things
those
they
should
failed
be
to do.
sequenced.
The three things they failed to do is put money in people's pockets, bank loans so they can limp along, and then a demand stimulus. All three they failed on. What is the explanation for their failure? Is it that it didn't occur to them? Or is it that they were so concerned about maintaining some level of fiscal prudence that they actually allowed problems to happen simply to keep the fiscal numbers pure?
No, I cannot guess what the workings were in the minds of the decision
In other words, it's a
makers.
failure that can't be explained.
No, it can be explained. I'm sure they would have a cogent explanation.
But they
for
haven't shared it with us.
They haven't shared it with us, but that's their prerogative.
But then it could be a failure that the government doesn't accept as a failure.
No,
because they don't feel the need to explain.
It could be simply that during the first wave, the government recognized that a lot of the damage that was being done was of its own doing because of this prolonged lockdown. And it felt that it was incumbent on it to do something about it. In the second, the central government took no administrative measures at all. It was all done at the state level.
And so the central government felt it didn't need to act.
The
That the state governments have.
Yes.
But the state governments didn't have the money.
Not only that, state governments don't have the authority to either instruct banks to give moratoriums or to be able to guarantee loans.
This sounds to me as if in passing the buck to state governments, the central government acted irresponsibly. When it should have acted, it failed to act.
Well, I think on the question of responsibility and irresponsibility, I think is the question of who is more capable of doing what.
But you're clearly saying the central government is more capable.
I think the central government acted responsibly when it actually handed over the reins of COVID management to the states.
But what about economic management?
I'm coming to that. That was actually a responsible step, and I'm glad it was done. The point is, the irresponsibility came in not acknowledging the kind of damage that was being caused and recognizing that the state governments had no authority to be able to prevent that damage happening. And it was entirely incumbent on the central government to do so.
So the economic lack of action was irresponsible of the central government.
Yes.
You're saying that?
Yes.
This is where the central government's irresponsibility is clear, failure to act to limit the economic damage and thus permit the damage to happen and continue.
Yes.
Against this background then, identify for me what you think are the key concerns that must be addressed in the budget, which remember is in just 7 days' time.
So far as the key concerns are concerned, the first and foremost is to recognize that in order for the Indian economy to really grow at a stable, sustained 7% plus growth, corporate India and non-corporate India have to grow in tandem. You cannot have only one of them growing. And the reason for it is the manner in which employment is generated in the country and therefore how demand is generated. That should be the focus. So the big
Can I
challenge,
interrupt? What you're saying is the focus should be actually on the unorganized sector. Corporate India already is doing well. It's the unorganized that's not. That's what should be the focus.
well, I was coming to exactly that, which is that corporate India is doing well. The point is, what are you going to do about the non-corporate India? And that's unorganized is only a part of it. That really should be the focus. The problem there, of course, is that other than the instruments that the government had already used, they have very little. The only one that could actually turn things around is really a credit guarantee scheme of some kind for encouraging startups of various kinds, because these will literally be startups. Their old units have closed, they're going to have to start up again at that MSME level.
So these are guaranteed bank loans you're talking about.
Guaranteed loans by banks usually, yeah. Now, if you think about a guarantee, in terms of how much provisioning you need to do in the budget, that's minimal. You don't actually have to provide anything until the banks actually call in defaults. So in terms of the budgetary numbers, not much effect. They can actually show improvement in the fiscal deficit. But in terms of the impact, this may be about the only way that we can get the MSME sector moving again.
What about demand? Do they need to take specific measures to ensure that consumption goes up, that people actually have money in their pockets to consume, to make up for that 5% dip in consumption that you spoke about?
Well, you see, again, the budget numbers that we had are perfectly okay. I don't think you need any great increase over and above. The real question is, where are you putting it? Where is that money going? If it is going into projects and expenditures which can be actually absorbed by the corporate sector, then you're not making things any better. You're helping the divide grow. However, if you put it in projects where the corporates are by and large not interested, and it will be
What sort of projects would these be?
These would be actually fairly localized kinds of projects, like rural roads. Rural roads are done by essentially small contractors, various kinds of small waterways,
So you're saying that the focus of government expenditure should be on projects where small local contractors get the money rather than big corporates. And you're talking, as an example, rural roads, rural waterways. You're saying this should be another focus of the budget.
Yes. But look, it does focus in the sense there are already schemes which address each of these areas. So the real question is whether you're going to add a new scheme or you're going to strengthen a scheme that you already have because it's going to give you the desired effect.
presumably strengthening an old scheme is better than trying to create
better
a new one.
because the institutions are in place.
But of course, this begs the question once again. You may commit yourself in the budget to spending a lot of money on these schemes, but you actually have to spend it.
Well, in most of cases, the expenditure on these kinds of schemes is really driven by state governments. So the central government will have to work hand in glove with the state government.
That means also you need a change in attitude to the state governments. You need to ensure that you cooperate with them rather than on issues like IAS begin to create rivals and divisions between yourselves.
Well, on this, I think, on this specific economic part of it, I think the states would be more than happy to reciprocate.
What about
the question is, will the center do it?
That's the big question.
That's a big question.
What about direct payment of money to the poor, a sort of income support scheme to ensure that at the level at which it's needed, there is money available to boost consumption, because these people have a huge capacity to spend everything they get.
Of course, I mean, as a demand side stimulus, that is positive. But the simple thing is, Karan, that is not going to enable new entrepreneurs to come in and replace the ones which have died.
So the bigger focus
is to recreate the capacity that has withered away.
So what you're saying is, it's not so much income support that's needed as a focused attention on recreating the capacity that's withered away, bringing back the small MSMEs that died by giving them guaranteed bank loans.
And therefore, who would employ people, which would generate the income that would support consumption. But that would be a durable consumption. Otherwise, what you're suggesting in terms of just a dole is that till economic activity picks up, you'll have to continue to pay it. Otherwise, that person will slip back into dire poverty again.
So we've established two key areas where you believe the budget needs to focus. One is to provide guaranteed bank loans to ensure that small little entrepreneurs at the MSME level can begin startups again,
yes.
and that you recreate the capacity that got eliminated or died during the second wave when the
yes.
government failed to act.
Yes.
In other words, the government has to now make up for what it didn't do.
Yeah.
Right?
And this will cost you, in a sense, less budgetarily, because the government will only be giving guarantees.
And in a sense, if I recall correctly, 3-4 months ago, Soumyakanti Ghosh, in fact, proposed something like this in one of the articles that he writes periodically for the Times of India. You're in fact just taking it further and saying this should now be a central part of what the budget tackles and does.
That is correct.
And the other thing you're saying is that the government needs to also focus a lot of its expenditure on small, local, rural projects, rural roads, rural waterways, because that again gives money to small contractors, not big corporates.
Yes.
Do they need to do anything about boosting private investment?
Look, private corporate investment is doing well. So when you talked about this 33% of GDP investment, it was entirely corporate investment plus public investment. The missing element there was the non-corporate investment, which is what's called the household sector. Investment by the household sector is down seriously. And what we are talking about now is reviving that investment, not the corporate investment. That's doing just fine, thank you.
And the
capital markets are proof.
And that will be revived by the bank loan guarantee scheme for the small entrepreneurs.
We hope.
What about something else? Is there a limit on how much you can allow the fiscal deficit to grow this time around? Does she need to reduce it beyond 6.8? Assuming she meets 6.8, does she need to reduce it beyond 6.8?
At the moment, no. In fact, I think until we have a take on the trajectory of the disease, COVID, I think it would be incautious to try to correct the fiscal deficit too quickly.
So another year at 6.8 would be fine by you?
Well, you see, the thing is, budget for it, because if you don't budget for it, preparatory work doesn't happen. Budget for it by all means, but if you find that
when you say it, what is the it figure? 6.8?
Well, the figure in itself I'm not hung up on. What I'm hung up on is what you're doing on the expenditure side.
But you have no problem if it's a large figure.
I have no problems, not as of now, a large figure at all. And if circumstances permit, you can actually do the fiscal correction in the middle of the year.
Finally, what about promises the government made last year which haven't been fulfilled? I'm talking about some made in the budget when they committed themselves to privatizing 2 public sector banks and a general insurance company. Promises made, I think it was in May, when they sketched out a strategic privatization plan as well as extensive asset monetization, which was part of the national monetization pipeline. They seem to have been forgotten.
Well, at least on the privatization part, there is some movement. On the asset monetization, very little. But I would have thought asset monetization would be the easier, but clearly not.
But does the government need to take steps in the budget to ensure people that these are promises they intend to fulfill, or can they be forgotten and left by the wayside?
Well, you know, the real question, in terms of the sheer economics of it, something like privatization or asset monetization for that matter makes sense only if and only if that the government is in dire need of funds to support a vastly expanded expenditure program.
But that expenditure program doesn't exist at the moment.
Yeah, at the moment I don't see it as compelling. On the other hand, when the economy is in doldrums, which I still think it is, despite the figures that have been put out, this can actually be counterproductive, because what happens is that you then rechannel investment funds from new projects to buying up existing assets,
which doesn't provide growth at all.
Which doesn't provide you growth. What it provides is simply a change of ownership of the asset. That's all that happens.
So in other words, soft peddling this for a while would be quite happy.
Well, I'd be quite happy with that.
We're coming right to the end of this interview, Professor Sen. Let me put this to you. I get the impression that you're still very concerned about A, the state of the economy, B, you're particularly worried about the collapse in demand and the outcome of that for the MSME sector. And you believe that if the government doesn't focus on that and doesn't find ways of rebuilding those enterprises that died during the second wave, the economy's prospects for the next 2-3 years are not going to be bright and brilliant.
No. As I said, that we should be targeting a sustained growth of 7% plus. Anything less than that, I think, should be unacceptable to us as citizens. And that requires corporate India and MSMEs to grow together. Corporate India is growing already.
It's the MSMEs.
It's the MSMEs. So you don't need to fiddle with anything that's doing well, but you do certainly need to support those components which are not.
And here your concern, as you said, is that the government doesn't seem to be either aware of the MSME problem, or if it is aware, it's not talking about it, and it certainly isn't acting in a way that you'd like. We have to wait and see what they do, but as of now, the government has...
Well, that's why I said, that's why I think this budget would be interesting.
But up till now, the government has sort of turned a blind eye.
Up to now, it has not, yes.
And that's particularly worrying, because this is a problem that's been staring them in the face, and they've either looked away or they've done nothing.
Well, I don't know whether it's been staring them in the face. I am not even sure what these systems are in the government at present to track these kinds of issues.
But that's even worse. If they don't have the system to track a problem of this nature...
Well, I know, they may well have, which I'm not aware of. Earlier, it used to be the planning
But it's getting worse and worse, sir. If they don't have the system, it means they're blind. If they do have the system to track it and they haven't responded, then it seems they're unconcerned.
Yes, it could be.
And that's a bizarre situation. We either have a government that's blind to the problem or unconcerned about the problem. And we're now hoping that in the budget that's presented in exactly a week's time, they will have opened their eyes and responded. But up till now, they've been blind and unconcerned. That is worrying.
Blind and or unconcerned.
Blind and or unconcerned. That is worrying, isn't it, sir?
Yeah. It is.
My
if
very
it, if
last...
it, if it is,
I mean,
if it is the case. But
and this brings me back to the word I used earlier. This looks like irresponsibility, because that's what governments are there to do, to see and to act. But if you're blind and or unconcerned, you're neither seeing nor acting.
no, but the acting part of it can be a little centralized, but the seeing part of it has to be organized. This is the thing.
But governments are there to organize it, and if they're not...
Well, this is the thing. One would have thought that Niti Aayog would be the natural place to organize this kind of seeing, where you're taking in the perspectives from all the ministries and putting it together into a picture. Because if each ministry is putting it up separately without somebody putting the mosaic together, what you're going to get is a Tower of Babel. And
but this is getting worse and worse.
no, as I said, I don't know.
Absolutely. But there's a real possibility that they've got little bits and pieces of the picture, but they haven't stitched it together to create the mosaic, and so they don't know. But that's what governments are there to do, to stitch together the bits and pieces into a big picture. And if they're not, that's even worse.
You'd be surprised how many governments don't do that.
Well, yes, that may be an explanation, but it's particularly worrying for people that we're staring at a situation where economists like you have been able to identify the problem and the remedy, and we don't know whether the government has identified the problem because they don't talk about it and they haven't acted.
Well,
blind and or unconcerned was your phrase.
That's a little unfair, Karan. I don't take the responsibility for my views. I mean, they are my views. The government, on the other hand, has to take responsibility, which means they have to be a whole lot more careful than I am.
Which is why they don't express a view, because they're terribly scared if they did, they'd be held accountable for it, and therefore, rather than be accountable, be silent instead. I have to tell you, we've reached a point where all one can do is smile and laugh, because nothing else seems to be possible. My very last question. The audience who've heard you will say to themselves when they watch the budget in exactly 7 days' time, hallelujah, fingers crossed, let's hope she does what is required. What are the 2-3 things you can tell them that they should look out for?
I would imagine it would be her opening remarks, where she lays out the challenges that she wishes to address in her budget. Once you go into the details of taxes and expenditures, it just becomes
difficult to follow for most
people. It's impossible to follow unless you've got the past budgets in front of you and you're comparing what's going on, which is an expert's job. You have people.
So
in
you're
Bombay
saying
who
to
do
the
just
audience, listen carefully to the first 4 or 5 minutes, which are her opening remarks.
It could be even longer. I mean,
10, 15 maybe.
Yeah, 10,
but
15.
Listen to the
opening remarks and what she outlines as the weaknesses, not so much the strengths of our economy.
The weaknesses and the problems she has to
address.
Ah.
That's the critical thing. And then ask yourself the question, do I think these are the weaknesses that should be addressed?
It also means that if she doesn't address the weaknesses and accept them as challenges that you've just laid out, then we know that once again, blind and or unconcerned continues for another year.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether I should thank you, Professor Seno. You've left us in a very depressed state.
Well, no. Listen to the budget speech.
Absolutely, listen to the budget.
You may be surprised.
Or you may be depressed.
Or you may be depressed. You're already depressed, so it's not going to make it any worse.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for opening our eyes. At least we, after this interview, will not be blind, but we're terribly concerned.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.